After 45 years of what appeared to be Hollywood's most unshakable marriage, Meryl Streep shocked the entertainment world when she quietly walked away from her husband, Don Gummer, leaving behind a relationship that had weathered decades of fame, pressure, and countless red carpet appearances together. For nearly half a century, they had been the couple that made marriage look effortless, raising 4 successful children while she became one of cinema's greatest legends and he built his own respected career as a sculptor. But behind the carefully maintained privacy that had protected their family for so long, something had fundamentally shifted. The separation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't the result of a single dramatic moment that tabloids love to sensationalize. Instead, what unfolded was far more complex and, in many ways, more heartbreaking than any Hollywood scandal. While fans had grown accustomed to seeing Meryl and Don as the embodiment of lasting love in an industry notorious for destroying relationships, the truth was that their marriage had been quietly unraveling for years before anyone outside their inner circle knew what was happening. What makes this story particularly fascinating is not just the length of their relationship but how completely they had managed to keep their struggles private. Unlike other celebrity couples whose personal problems become public spectacles, Meryl and Don had mastered the art of maintaining dignity even as their marriage reached its end. There were no bitter public statements, no leaked stories about infidelity, and no messy custody battles over their adult children. Instead, there was something far more subtle and, perhaps, more devastating. The final catalyst that led to their separation wasn't a betrayal or a scandal in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something that had been building beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect partnership for years. Those closest to the couple later revealed that the decision to part ways came after a series of quiet conversations about who they had become as individuals and whether the people they were at the beginning of their marriage still existed within the relationship they had built together. What Don Gummer did, or perhaps more accurately, what he stopped doing, created a gulf between two people who had once been inseparable. The revelation of what actually happened behind the closed doors of their Connecticut home reveals not just the end of a marriage, but the complex reality of what it means to grow and change alongside another person for nearly 5 decades. Join us as we uncover the untold story of how Hollywood's most private power couple quietly decided that love, sometimes, means knowing when to let go. To understand what ultimately drove Meryl Streep and Don Gummer apart, we must first return to the beginning, to 1978, when two grief-stricken souls found each other during one of the darkest periods of Meryl's life. She had just lost John Cazale, the brilliant actor who had been her partner and creative soulmate, to lung cancer. His death at just 42 years old had left Meryl emotionally devastated and questioning everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and what it meant to build a life with another person. Don Gummer entered her world through her brother, Harry, at a moment when Meryl was still raw from mourning. Unlike the intense, artistic relationship she had shared with Cazale, Don offered something entirely different: stability, quiet strength, and a creative passion that existed separate from the demanding world of Hollywood. As a sculptor, he understood the artistic temperament but lived in a world of marble, bronze, and clay rather than cameras, scripts, and the constant scrutiny that followed Meryl's every professional move. Their courtship was swift and, some would later say, born from mutual need rather than the slow burn of deep friendship that often creates the strongest foundations. Within 6 months of meeting, they were married in a simple ceremony, with Meryl still processing the grief that had defined her previous year. What began as two people helping each other heal gradually transformed into something deeper, a partnership that would span decades and create a family that became Meryl's proudest achievement. Don proved to be everything Meryl needed during those early years of building her legendary career. While she disappeared into demanding roles that required her to access profound emotional depths, he provided a sanctuary of normalcy. He never competed with her fame, never demanded attention for his own considerable artistic achievements, and never made her choose between her career and their family. Instead, he created space for both, supporting her through the intensity of performances while maintaining their home as a refuge from the chaos of celebrity life. Their 4 children, Henry, Mamie, Grace, and Louisa, grew up watching their parents navigate fame with unusual grace. Don's influence on their family dynamic was profound. He encouraged creativity without pushing his children toward public careers, supported Meryl's demanding schedule without resentment, and created an atmosphere where artistic expression was valued but never performed for public consumption. For years, this balance seemed perfect, creating what many considered the ideal marriage between two creative individuals. But balance, especially in a relationship spanning decades, requires constant adjustment and mutual growth. What worked beautifully in their 30s and 40s began creating subtle tensions as they moved through their 50s and 60s, developing into people who shared a history but no longer shared the same vision for their future together. As Meryl's career reached unprecedented heights throughout the 80s and 90s, earning her a record number of Academy Award nominations and establishing her as the gold standard for serious acting, something subtle but significant began shifting in her marriage to Don. The very qualities that had made their relationship work so beautifully in the beginning started creating an invisible distance between them, a gap that widened so gradually that neither of them fully recognized what was happening until it had become impossible to bridge. The demands of Meryl's career had always required sacrifice from both of them, but those sacrifices became more complex as the years progressed. Early in their marriage, Don's willingness to support her ambitions had felt like love in its purest form. He would relocate his studio whenever her work required them to move, adjust his own artistic schedule around her filming commitments, and shoulder the primary responsibility for their children's day-to-day care when Meryl disappeared into particularly demanding roles. This arrangement had worked because both of them believed they were building something together, creating a family legacy that honored both of their artistic visions. But as Meryl's fame grew beyond anything either of them had anticipated, the balance began to shift in ways that left Don feeling increasingly invisible within his own life. Friends close to the family later revealed that Don had begun expressing frustration about always being referred to as Meryl Streep's husband rather than being recognized for his own considerable achievements as a sculptor. His work had been exhibited in prestigious galleries and earned critical acclaim, but in social situations, at industry events, and even in casual encounters with strangers, his identity had become secondary to his wife's towering reputation. More troubling was the growing sense that Meryl's emotional availability had become compartmentalized in ways that left little room for the kind of intimate partnership they had once shared. Her ability to disappear completely into her roles, which made her such an extraordinary actress, began extending beyond her professional life. Don confided to close friends that he sometimes felt like he was living with a stranger, watching his wife transform into different people for months at a time and then struggle to find her way back to the woman he had married. The turning point came not during a single dramatic confrontation, but through a series of quiet realizations that accumulated over their final years together. Don had spent decades supporting Meryl's dreams while quietly sacrificing his own need for recognition, partnership, and emotional intimacy. What he ultimately did was make a decision that surprised everyone who knew them: he chose himself. For the first time in their marriage, Don Gummer decided that his own happiness mattered as much as maintaining the perfect image of their relationship, and that decision changed everything. The moment that ultimately ended Meryl Streep's 45-year marriage wasn't a betrayal in the traditional sense, but rather an act of quiet rebellion that forced both of them to confront the reality of what their relationship had become. According to sources close to the family, Don Gummer made a decision that blindsided Meryl not because it was cruel or unexpected, but because it revealed how completely they had lost touch with each other's inner lives. In late 2017, as Meryl was preparing for what would become one of her most demanding roles, Don quietly began making arrangements to establish a permanent studio space in Connecticut, separate from their shared home. But this wasn't simply about creating more room for his sculpture work. Don had decided to begin living independently, maintaining their marriage in public while essentially creating separate lives behind closed doors. What shocked Meryl wasn't the physical separation itself, but the realization that Don had been planning this transition for months without feeling comfortable enough to discuss it with her directly. The conversations that followed this revelation were described by those who knew them as heartbreaking and ultimately liberating for both parties. Don explained that he had felt emotionally abandoned for years, not because Meryl had stopped loving him, but because her capacity for intimacy had become so consumed by her work that there was nothing left for their marriage. He had watched her transform into dozens of different characters while feeling like she had forgotten how to simply be present with him as herself. What he had done was refuse to continue pretending that everything was fine. Instead of having the difficult conversations about their growing disconnect, instead of demanding more attention or asking her to scale back her career, Don had chosen to quietly remove himself from the equation. He continued to support her publicly, attend necessary events, and maintain the facade of their perfect marriage while essentially living as a single man. For Meryl, this discovery was devastating because it forced her to confront how completely she had taken Don's unwavering support for granted. She had assumed that his love meant he would always be there, always be willing to sacrifice his own needs for hers, and always be content to live in her shadow. The realization that he had been unhappy for years while she remained oblivious to his struggles shattered her understanding of their relationship. The formal separation announcement wouldn't come until 2023, but the marriage had effectively ended the moment Meryl discovered that the man she thought she knew better than anyone had been planning a life without her for months. Don Gummer's quiet act of self-preservation had revealed the painful truth that love without presence, support without intimacy, and partnership without genuine connection cannot sustain a marriage, no matter how perfect it appears from the outside. The aftermath of this quiet revelation transformed both Meryl and Don in ways that surprised those who had watched their marriage from afar. Rather than descending into bitterness or public recrimination, they handled their separation with the same dignity that had characterized their relationship for decades. Don continued his work as a sculptor with renewed energy, finally able to pursue his art without the constant pressure of supporting someone else's far more visible career. Meanwhile, Meryl began the difficult process of rediscovering who she was outside of the roles she played, both professionally and personally. What emerged from this painful transition was a newfound understanding between two people who had genuinely loved each other but had lost the ability to be present in that love. Don's decision to prioritize his own emotional well-being had initially felt like abandonment to Meryl, but over time, she came to recognize it as an act of courage that had freed them both from a relationship that had become more obligation than partnership. They remained connected through their children and grandchildren, maintaining a respectful friendship built on shared history rather than romantic expectation. The separation also opened unexpected doors in Meryl's personal life. Her growing friendship with comedian Martin Short, sparked during their collaboration on Only Murders in the Building, offered her a glimpse of what companionship could look like when built on genuine enjoyment of each other's company rather than decades of accumulated responsibility. Whether their relationship remains platonic or develops into something deeper, it represents a new chapter for someone who had spent most of her adult life defining herself in relation to other people's needs. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Meryl Streep's divorce lies not in what went wrong, but in what both parties ultimately got right. Don Gummer's decision to quietly remove himself from a marriage that no longer served either of them demonstrated that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling a dynamic that has stopped working. And Meryl's ability to accept this reality, to grieve the end of their partnership without vilifying the man who had supported her for so long, showed a level of emotional maturity that few people achieve. Their story reminds us that even the most seemingly perfect relationships require constant attention, genuine presence, and the courage to address problems before they become insurmountable. Love alone is not enough to sustain a marriage when the people within it stop growing together and begin growing apart. What do you think about Meryl Streep's approach to handling her separation so privately? Have you ever experienced a relationship that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty within? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's most fascinating figures.